Hey, I'm Malcolm Hadley here at Cane Creek, and today I'm going to show you how to change the air volume in your DBAir shock. We're going to start with first letting the air out of the shock. So I'm going to depress the air valve. Air cap is off naturally. Now that you'll have an O-ring at the lower eyelet of the shock, you'll notice it on the air can here. You can grab this and kind of pinch the shock, and pinch the O-ring, get it to kind of crawl out of its gland. If that doesn't work, then you can take a pick, a dental style pick, and pry the O-ring out. You still kind of want to give it a little push forward to get some slack in that O-ring. And then once you pry the O-ring out, set that to the side. Now you have access to removing the air can. So we'll take the shock, mount it in a vise, eyelet down. A rubber strap wrench is needed. This is only simply to give you leverage on the shock. So you mount the strap wrench, tighten it up. We're going to twist clockwise or counterclockwise, whichever way you want, whichever direction your strap wrench is in, and pull down on the air can. It's also a good idea to have a soft jaw vise to do this. If you don't have a soft jaw vise, it's a real good idea to put a rag in your vise. That way when you drop this air can, you're landing on something that's not going to scratch or dent the can. Now the air can, the outer can, is able to be removed. Pulling it off. Set that to the side. Now you have one O-ring at the lower end of the eyelet and another O-ring at the upper end of the shock of the air can itself. At this point, we're going to remove one more O-ring, which is down at the eyelet. For this, the dental pick comes in handy. Sometimes you don't need to remove this, but I like to get it out of the way anyway. Now we're going to take our air volume reduction sleeve, get this on the shock, crawl this over the can, slide that all the way forward. Makes it a little easier to assemble the shock. Now we'll go back and remount this O-ring. This O-ring goes in the upper gland, not the one closest to the eyelet. It's also a good time to take some shock lube. We use a Slick Honey here. Lube this O-ring continuously. Go back and lube the other O-ring. It just helps you get the air can back on. It's a little bit easier to deal with. I like to work that in. Now you're going to reinstall the air can. The air can's air valve is going to point towards the cylinder head of the shock or the reservoir end. At this point, you can get it on a firm surface and kind of crawl the shock with the O-ring. You're kind of crawling it into the outer air can, working around it. I'm going to move this over to a more firm surface here. And what you're doing is making sure that O-ring doesn't pop out of the gland. So I just kind of work it around. Everything looks good. I don't have an O-ring poking out of either side. So now I can get to the point where I get to the end of it. And now we're going to pull the air can back up towards the reservoir. This is where your strap wrench is going to come in handy. Tighten it up in the vise. Now you're going to be pulling up, so you want to make sure the vise is tight. You can try two methods here. Since you just re-greased the can, you may be able to just slide this right back on with a rag. So I'm going to turn the can twisting and pulling up at the same time. And that allowed the O-ring to go inside the air can. Now it's installed. If that was a difficult installation, we would then come back and repeat the process using the strap wrench. The strap wrench just gives us some leverage because your can's kind of slick from the grease. And that way you can pull up at once on the rubber strap wrench, having a lot more leverage to pull and twist. So you reinstall it in the same fashion. Now at this point, you can clock your air can fairly easy because all the grease is on the O-rings. On a shock that's had air in it, it's more difficult to do this by hand, so you'll need to use the strap wrench. So if you know the orientation of where your air valve needs to be, left or right side of the bike, either at say 2 o'clock or 10 o'clock, if you're looking at a clock, this air valve now can be turned simply by hand because it's greased. I'm looking down. If I was looking at a clock, 2 o'clock's over to the right, that's where I want this air valve on this particular shock. At this point, you remove the shock. You have to install the last O-ring here into the O-ring gland at the eyelet. This is keeping the air can in place. So when you inflate the air can, this expands and trapping the air can from sliding off the shock or having any kind of accident. So there you have it. You've installed your volume adjustment sleeve and you're ready to ride.